All right, welcome to our session. We're going to talk about the role and responsibilities of the FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center, and then the relationship between FICA, POCA, and POCDATARA. So, Chris, I've got to ask all these acronyms, etc. So maybe I could start with you again, just positioning the FIC, the center, and then we'll talk about the rest of the legislation. Just position the FIC for us.
Okay, thank you. During the first lesson, we spoke about the establishment of the Financial Action Task Force, what its purpose was, and that it is a giant information gathering machine in order to make predictions about what was going to happen with money laundering and the likes in future. Now, if you understand that, then you take a country bespoke version of the FATF, then that is our Financial Intelligence Center. It is a center which has been established by law, by the Financial Intelligence Center Act, and the express purpose of the Financial Intelligence Center is to ensure that the information that the FATF wants from us as a country is forthcoming, and it collects that information from institutions, businesses that are called accountable institutions, and also in some instances from members of the general public. And the way that in which it collects that information is prescribed in the form of a number of reports. I can't recall the exact number. I know that we're going to get there, but it's something like 13 or 14 different kinds of reports, and they are quite strict about the format and the information, the veracity of the information that gets reported, because if they are not strict on that, then they can't rely on it, and it tends to dilute the value of the data that we push to the Financial Action Task Force. So it is the main function of the FIC is to collect, collate and remit information. Second function, as important, but perhaps not on the international level, is that they must also, when they receive those reports and there is obvious evidence of criminality, they must also refer that evidence and that information to the various enforcement bodies like the police services and that kind of thing. And to that end, there is a committee that has been established by law where those communication lines must be kept open, because we can't just keep pushing information internationally and wait for the trickle-down effect. We also have to act in the enforcement mechanisms that we have to make sure that we cover that. Now, the reason that I mentioned that is later on we're going to be dealing with all the obligations that the Act imposes on accountable institutions, like training your staff, like registering, like appointing a money laundering compliance officer, and conducting customer due diligence, the whole range of those obligations. And if you consider carefully what the purpose of those obligations are, they are simply there to ensure that an accountable institution is able to identify when a report needs to be made. So everything around that is there to support the making of a report. That is the key, that is the crucial thing. That is the golden currency with which our country deals internationally through the FIC. So I hope that kind of helps a little bit, because I think people very often ask me, why do we have to do training, or why do we have to do X, Y, and Z? It is because all of those things support your ability to make reports. It is also for that reason that people often confuse the FICA and money laundering to think that if you get charged with money laundering, that you get charged under the FICA. The FICA does not contain a criminal provision for money laundering. The only criminal provision, there are many offences, but for those offences, they will impose certain administrative sanctions, which we're going to get back to, I think. But there's only one real criminal offence for which you can get charged in terms of the FICA, and that is for failing to make a report. So you can already see where the importance is and where the emphasis lies. So what happens then if you're a money launderer? Under what legislation do you get charged? Okay. Money laundering, by its very, very definition, always involves more than one person. You can't launder money if you need to have someone who receives the hot cash and someone who cleans it and reintroduces it into the economy and that kind of thing. So because there's more than one person involved, it falls under the prevention of Organised Crime Act. So it is like any other organised crime, like gang-related crimes and all of those things. If you get charged for money laundering, you'll be charged under POCA, not under the FICA. We mentioned earlier that one of the aspects that the FATF and the FICA also wants South Africans to focus on is the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the financing of terrorist activities. So again, those things, if you are convicted and charged, you will not be charged in terms of the FICA, but you will be charged in terms of now I've got to be really careful, the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorist and Related Activities Act, which is POCDATARA. Okay. So just worth mentioning that if you fail to make a report under FICA and you get charged criminally, you may cough up to 100 million rand in penalties and fines. If you fail to do screening under customer due diligence and you do business with someone whose name appears on a list of sanctioned individuals, whether they are on the United Nations Consolidated List or whether they're on the Targeted Financial Sanctions List, and you ought to have known that that person is such a person, and you get charged under POCDATARA, you might end up with a life imprisonment sentence. So they're not playing games, you know.
It was a mouthful. So on the ground, how do you see this play out within your client base? There must obviously be a huge focus on reporting and risk management, etc., to avoid any of these. Chris, you have got a broad client base. The two ladies next to me, you focused on financial services providers, attorneys, and auditors. So amongst the three of you, you are looking at a broad spectrum. So Chris, I'm going to come back to you from a broad perspective, but focusing on your client base, how Chris has positioned the center, the Financial Intelligence Center, its role and responsibilities. How do you engage with the center, or do you do that via the FSCA more often?
So I think clients engage directly if they need to as an accountable institution. Quite often the FIC will only speak to the accountable institution themselves and not to us as an external compliance officer. However, because the FIC themselves do not come out to do a review or an audit or an inspection, as they call it, they hand that responsibility to the FSCA. And practically, they'll come for an inspection. There's a bunch of analysts. I'd like to say that a client is given ample opportunity, time to prepare, time to provide all the information. But needless to say, if you get an inspection from the FIC, you are on high alert. I would say generally, clients are very nervous, very scared. So we are there to assist them through the entire process in the background. But it's pretty serious. Any kind of inspection from the FIC is very important. And I think it's critical that a client obliges and works with the process, because if you work with the process, you can really come out, yes, if you've made errors, you will get knocked, on the knuckles, and you'll get some kind of sanction or some kind of penalty or whatever. But it's a workable arrangement when we deal with the FIC. They understand their piece of work that they need to come and do in detail. So you really need to have your processes in place. And I think the money laundering compliance officer is one of the key individuals when it comes to a FIC inspection on the ground.
Germa, the message I get from industry is that the FSCA has got a very competent and thorough FIC team that does some of the inspections. Any comments you want to add to our conversation and your experience with the FSCA,
Yes.
people who
So just to add to what Nirishi said, I think it all boils down to training and understanding what is expected from you and ensuring that you adhere to all of those requirements in terms of the Act. And then when you get to an on-site inspection, it is quite daunting and grueling. And whether you're a one-man practice or a big corporate, they treat you in the same way. They drill through every single detailed document, examples of every report, examples of your risk ratings for your clients, your RMCP in particular. If there's one section missing from your RMCP, you will get a fine. So it's very, very important to understand what is expected of you and to simply adhere to that.
And I think what's good in a way is that when they're coming for an inspection, they're trying to understand that everything is not just a piece of policy that you've written. They want to understand, well, if you wrote this in your policy, how are you doing that practically in an example of a file? So it is not something that you just roll out a template for, because every business is different, the nature, the scale, the complexity is different. So one cannot just copy paste and say, I've got an RMCP template and that's enough. They want to understand practically in your business how you've applied the FICA Act.
Yes.
Perhaps just on a point of clarification, reference was made earlier about the FIC not doing inspections, but the FSCA doing inspections. That is absolutely true in respect of financial services. How the FIC effectively monitors compliance and enforces compliance is through the appointment of what they refer to as supervisory bodies. So it has entered into an agreement with the FSCA to perform those monitoring services on their behalf. On the FIC's behalf. And similarly, there have been some other supervisory bodies in the past. There still are some supervisory bodies. Not all of them have completed their tasks with sufficient vigor, and so some of their appointments have been withdrawn, and so on. So, but there are other supervisory bodies, and in addition to which the FIC also sends teams out. They obviously have limited manpower, whereas the FSCA in financial services has a much greater resource, but the FIC also does inspections, and it's pretty much the same.
So perhaps just to conclude the session, we now know what the role and responsibility of the Financial Intelligence Center is. We know that they almost outsource or have entered into arrangements with supervisory bodies. So it's really a broad umbrella. And if I can illustrate it in a way that the FIC is real, the inspections are real, and when they take place, it's not an inspection light. They do it thoroughly, and you better have your ducks in a row. So for our listeners, it may be an opportune time to revisit your risk management strategy and your document, your RMCP. Yes. So your policy needs to be in place, and I wonder how many businesses truly can demonstrate that they comply with their risk management policy. And that seems to be one of the areas that the supervisory bodies will definitely, that's one of their main areas. So not to try and scare anybody, but it certainly is one of the most important aspects in any of the businesses. Money laundering is real, financing of terrorism is real, and we just need to do our part. It's an international a piece of legislation. If we look at Financial Intelligence Center, the Act itself, it's not a South African only issue. It is an international piece of legislation, and we certainly need to play our part. But things seems with the grey listing, it's one of those critical areas that all businesses will have to get in place going forward.